There is an old, largely forgotten British nickname that Spanish royal watchers have quietly begun invoking in private conversations about Princess Leonor, one borrowed from 16th-century England rather than anything in Spain's own history. The Virgin Queen. Elizabeth I of England reigned for 45 years, never married, produced no heir, and in doing so permanently reshaped the English monarchy's relationship to marriage as a political instrument. It is a comparison that sounds almost absurd applied to a 20-year-old Spanish princess who has barely finished military training, and yet it points toward a genuinely serious structural question that the Spanish Constitution and the Spanish monarchy have never had to seriously confront in the modern era. What actually happens to the crown, and to the line of succession, if Princess Leonor simply never marries at all? Let's start with what the Spanish Constitution actually says, because the honest answer is considerably less dramatic than the premise suggests, and that itself is worth understanding. Article 57 of the Constitution addresses marriage only in a negative, restrictive sense. It states that if a person entitled to succeed to the crown marries against the express prohibition of the king and the Cortes Generales, that person and their descendants are excluded from the line of succession. This clause exists to prevent a specific historical problem, an heir marrying someone the state considers destabilizing or inappropriate, not to compel an heir to marry at all. There is no constitutional requirement, anywhere in Spanish law, that the monarch or the heir to the throne must marry, must produce children, or must do anything at all regarding their romantic life in order to inherit or to reign. In strictly legal terms, Leonor could remain unmarried for the rest of her life and reign as Queen of Spain without violating a single provision of the 1978 Constitution. The entire premise of this video, in other words, is not a legal crisis waiting to happen. It's a structural and cultural question about what an unmarried, childless monarchy actually does to long-term dynastic stability, which is a very different and in some ways more interesting problem. To understand why it's a real problem despite being legally a non-issue, you have to think 2 generations ahead rather than one. If Leonor reigns and has no children, the line of succession simply moves laterally to her younger sister, Infanta Sofia, exactly the same mechanism that would apply if Leonor died without heirs. That part is straightforward and constitutionally uncomplicated. The complication arrives if Sofia also has no children, or if Sofia predeceases Leonor, because at that point Spain would be looking at the extinguishing of Felipe VI's direct line entirely, forcing the country back to Article 57's more obscure provisions addressing what happens when named lines of succession become extinct, which hands the entire question over to the Cortes Generales to resolve in whatever manner it judges most suitable for Spain's interests. That is about as vague and unsettling a fallback position as a modern constitutional monarchy can have, essentially an admission that the drafters of the 1978 Constitution never seriously planned for 2 consecutive childless generations at the top of the family tree, because in 1978 it would have seemed a wildly improbable scenario worth planning around. Historically, the closest precedent within Spain's own royal tradition is genuinely troubling rather than reassuring. Spain's last queen regnant before a hypothetical Leonor, Isabella II, reigned from 1833 to 1868, and her reign ended not because she lacked heirs but through outright revolution and exile, following decades of political instability partly fueled by controversy surrounding her own marriage, which was widely viewed as a politically engineered mismatch that produced years of court intrigue over the paternity and legitimacy of her children. Spain has, in other words, no clean historical template for a queen regnant whose marital status functions smoothly and uncontroversially. Every precedent involves marriage as a site of political vulnerability, either because it happened under contested circumstances or, in Leonor's hypothetical case, because it might not happen at all. Widening the lens to Europe more broadly actually offers more useful comparisons than Spain's own history does. Sweden's Queen Christina, who reigned in the 17th century, famously refused marriage throughout her reign, reportedly telling her council she had no inclination toward the institution, and ultimately abdicated in 1654 rather than marry to satisfy dynastic expectations, converting to Catholicism and living out her life in Rome as one of early modern Europe's most unusual monarchs. Britain, meanwhile, has 2 genuinely instructive examples. Elizabeth I reigned alone for 45 years, deliberately using the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic tool for decades without ever actually completing one, And when she died in 1603, the English crown passed not to a child of her own but sideways to James VI of Scotland, a cousin from an entirely different line. More recently, and less dramatically, Princess Anne, King Charles's sister, has remained a working member of the British royal family for decades, with a divorce and remarriage in her history that would have been genuinely scandalous under earlier norms, illustrating how quickly a monarchy's tolerance for unconventional personal arrangements can shift once the institution decides survival matters more than tradition. What all of these precedents share is a pattern worth naming directly. An unmarried or childless monarch does not, by itself, destroy a monarchy. What actually creates instability is the uncertainty and factional maneuvering that develops around an unresolved succession question while the monarch is still alive and reigning, because that uncertainty gives ambitious relatives, political factions, and foreign powers an opening to jockey for position long before anyone actually needs to. If Leonor were to reach her 30s or 40s as queen without marrying, the genuine risk to Spain would not be some sudden constitutional void. It would be years of speculative political maneuvering around Infanta Sofia and her own eventual children, with every one of Sofia's personal decisions scrutinized as a proxy referendum on the future of the entire dynasty, a pressure that would land on a woman who never asked to be first in line and may not welcome the scrutiny that comes with becoming the default backup plan. There is also a distinctly modern dimension to this question that Elizabeth I and Queen Christina never had to navigate, and it has to do with how contemporary Spanish and broader European society actually thinks about marriage as an institution. Marriage rates across Spain and most of Western Europe have declined substantially over the past 3 decades, and the cultural assumption that a woman in her 20s or 30s is necessarily moving toward marriage as a life milestone has weakened considerably, particularly among exactly the demographic Leonor belongs to, well-educated, career-focused young women navigating demanding professional paths. If Leonor delays marriage, or forgoes it entirely, she would in some sense simply be participating in a broader generational pattern rather than making an unusually radical personal choice. The tension is that a private citizen's choice to delay or skip marriage carries no institutional consequence, while the same choice made by a reigning monarch carries enormous institutional weight, because the Spanish crown's legitimacy has historically been tied, however loosely, to the implicit promise of dynastic continuity. It's also worth noting what actually changed within the Spanish royal family's own recent history to make an eventual unmarried queen more culturally survivable than it would have been a generation ago. King Felipe VI himself broke sharply with the tradition of marrying within European nobility or the aristocracy when he married Letizia Ortiz, a divorced television journalist with no royal or noble background whatsoever, a match that would have been unthinkable under his grandfather's or great-grandfather's expectations. That single decision demonstrated that the modern Spanish monarchy has already shown it is willing to bend historical convention considerably in service of personal choice and public relatability, so long as the institution itself survives the bending. An unmarried Queen Leonor would represent a further, more significant bend in that same direction, arguably a natural continuation of a trend her own father already set in motion, rather than a complete rupture from it. So what would actually change about Spain's future if Leonor never marries? In the short and medium term, likely far less than the premise implies. She would reign, she would perform her constitutional duties, and the machinery of state would continue functioning exactly as it does now, because nothing in Spanish law requires a monarch to marry. The genuine long-term risk is not legal but structural and psychological, an increasingly precarious dependence on Infanta Sofia and her own future choices to keep the dynastic line alive, and a monarchy whose ultimate survival across the second half of this century would rest on decisions being made by a woman who is not even first in line. Spain's constitution, drafted in an era when this scenario seemed almost inconceivable, offers no clean answer for what happens after that, only a vague instruction to let the Cortes Generales figure it out if the day ever comes. Whether that day arrives depends entirely on choices Leonor has not yet made, and may not make for decades, which means the honest answer to this video's title is not a prediction but an acknowledgement. Spain's future crown is, in this specific sense, already resting on a foundation the framers of its constitution left deliberately, perhaps even nervously, unfinished.